Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to one and all to the fourth day of Kurla Worki Design Forum. I'm Akshar and I will be the host for today's evening. This year, the theme of the forum, Response, Conflict, Response, intends to stimulate conversations on and around various responses, out of which emerges conflict, which can be seen as a constructive catalyst for provoking responses rather than something undesirable. With this, we begin the session on the second sub-theme, conflict, human. The collective has been opted in an age where the predominant rhetoric is iconic, self-sufficient, and individuality. Transactions have replaced relationships. What then are the experimental practices of dependency and agreement? To engage with us today for an insightful discussion on this sub-theme, we have with us Gautam Bhan. Gautam Bhan is the part of the School of Human Development at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, Bangalore. Gautam Bhan teaches, researches, and writes on the policies of urban poverty and inequality, urban and planning theories, housing, identity, and social practice. Sarosh Anklesaria is a critic at the Yale School of Architecture. He runs an independent design and research practice in architecture. He has worked as an architect with Deleuze, Cofidio, plus Renfro, NYC, HDM Basel, and VV Doshi in Ahmedabad. In addition to teaching at Yale, Sarosh has taught architecture at the School of Architecture at Tallinn, Cornell University, the Pratt University, and many more. Tatyana Bilbao. Tatyana Bilbao is a Mexican architect with her projects spanning all across the globe. She began her studio in 2004 with the aim of integrating social values, collaboration, and sensitive design approaches to architectural work. Bilbao holds a recurring teaching position at Yale University and has taught at Harvard GSD, AA in London, Columbia University, and many more. Professor Neelkanth Chaya is an architect and academician who taught at the School of Architecture, CEPT. After having practiced and taught in Nairobi, he moved his base from Africa to India. He has been greatly interested in teaching architecture, and his practice is a reflection of his intense involvement with the school. He has researched and worked extensively in the domain of architecture that is socially and technologically appropriate. Now I shall introduce the co-panelists who will share their projects with us today. Sanya is joining us from Mumbai. She has studied from School of Environment and Architecture, Mumbai. She says architecture seems to be explored in the space of black and white more often than not. Through the years, she has found her interests in the grays, the spaces of representation and experimentation. Suchetan. Suchetan is a final year student from Rachna Sansad Academy of Architecture, Mumbai. He has a keen interest in contributing to projects that are contextually driven and have a social, political, and economic impact on the built environment. Nikita Kulkarni from Belgaum, who is currently pursuing architecture from Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute of Architecture and Environmental Studies, Mumbai. She has a keen interest in studying the urban transitions and its interconnections, governance, identity, social structure, and ecology. Fakin is an architecture student at Silpakorn University from Bangkok, Thailand, where he grew an interest in tropical, sustainable, and community-based architecture. He believes that architecture alone cannot solve the problem. A multidisciplinary action is an essential part of any solution. Vatsal Shah, who is currently an architect and designer based in Mumbai, he completed his bachelor's degree from Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute of Architecture and Environmental Studies in Mumbai in 2019. He attempts to express the contextual poetics of a site through his designs and has developed a keen interest in understanding the legacy of modern architecture. Today's session will be moderated by Shubhra Raje, who's an architect and educator working in environments that engage diverse issues, multiple constituencies, and varying scales, from interior design and architecture to creative urbanism and conservation. Shubhra has been actively involved in the civic, educational, and cultural arena in both her bases in the United States and India, on commissions from neighborhood groups and community nonprofits, as well as conducting design studios and workshops that encourage young designers to become active in issues of social justice, and cultural patrimony. Thank you all for joining with us today from different parts and various time zones of the world. To quickly give you a brief outline of the session, the first half of today's session will be presentations by the 5 student panelists, 10 minutes each and 2 minutes break in between to clarify any doubts or raise any key points from our panelists. I would request everyone to abide by the time. The discussion will then be driven by the moderator and all the panelists. Further, it will be opened up to the attendees for Q&A. I request the audience to ask questions in Q&A tab of your Zoom window. When somebody's question gets selected, we will turn on your video and audio. So I request our first panelist Sanya, to share her presentation.
Hi everyone. So I'm assuming you can see my screen and hear me. If not, then please let me know. So today I'll be talking about my thesis, which is titled Spaces of Interplay Between the Planned and the Lived in a Bombay Development Department Choice. So I've experienced living in two forms of housing. Having grown up in a chawl, I've had the opportunity of spending the first 10 years of my life running races in the long gallery, looking at the string of houses and peeking inside some, stepping up on a chair near the parapet wall and calling out to my friends. A specific way of living comes forth in this narration. In the next 10 years of my life, I've lived in an apartment, which generated a completely different way of living. The housing society had gone under redevelopment, which meant people inhabiting the new space were the same as the old ones. But they would occupy space differently and their activities were different. If the people were the same, what was changing? It led me to the realization that there was something the space itself was doing, which was causing these changes. It was getting configured differently. So the thesis situates itself in this model and argues that the configuration of architectural elements affects the affordance of those elements. Affordance here, through the readings of James Gibson, talks about what the space can let the person do in it. The thesis further introduces the idea of interplay as the effect two spaces tend to have on each other. As shown here, the thesis concludes that the spaces of high interplay are observed to be generating a new way of life and new programs. For example, pausing and seeing the city go by, or the formation of the chalk near the beside the staircase, are all as a result of interplay between spaces. But this narrative of lived space is currently missing in the discussions on housing. The current narrative is dominated by standards and economic affordability. The thesis operates in this constant flux that currently exists between the planned space and the lived space. There's a constant conflict between the intentions of design, which is the planned space, and how the space is actually used or experienced by people, which is the lived space. Affordance and interplay can act as a bridge, as tools to bridge the gap between the planned and the lived. Now, the site of demonstration for the same is the Bombay Development Department Chawls in Worli, which is a set of 121 chawls with ample open spaces between them and maidans, etc. So each building is a G+3 building, and it has a total of 18 single-room tenements strung along a doubly loaded corridor with common toilets at one end of the building. So as a result of this doubly loaded configuration, the corridor is devoid of light most of the time. But what is observed is that the living still happens in this corridor through the day, and many objects spill out from the unit into the corridor along with different activities. So the approach towards the design is choosing retrofit over redevelopment. Currently, the narrative on site is that there is a shortage of housing, and the site should be densified because it is a prime location. But rather, what we observe is that the real estate market is down and there are no buyers for the traditional housing. Instead, what people require is well-facilitated housing, which is affordable. This can be achieved by retrofitting the existing building. Hence, the program is a support infrastructure for BDD, which consists of extensions to houses, connections, informal public spaces, and well-facilitated services. For this, the major decision taken was to invert the configuration of the existing chawl by opening up the central corridor and having fully loaded corridors on either side to provide the experience of a ledge. The current narrative is also about the shortage of space in the house and the lack of good services. So this would be worked out by combining two existing units and providing extensions to them. So I will talk about one building in detail, which is studied. So the building was studied to understand the number of people and the age groups of those people in each house. Now, this was important to be able to design the houses as typologies based on number of people and not a common intervention irrespective of it. So the second diagram, hence, is a culmination of this exercise of reconfiguring the building in that building itself with one new added floor. And the typologies generated are based on the location of the unit in the building. The third set of diagrams is a study to understand the scale in the sense that how much extension will provide how much living space to people. Through the research, a series of conditions came forth which afforded interplay between elements. For example, a ledge and something to look onto, or an opening which could be accessed from both ends and hence had high transaction capacity. The second were a set of scale studies which were done to understand at what point would less open space feel intimate and at what point does it start becoming oppressive. So the major finding was that in some cases, even though the open space was less, the transition from open to closed was subtle, and hence the semi-open spaces like the corridors also gave a feeling of openness and intimacy. The overall design idea is that the intervention is a wraparound structure around the existing DDD chawl with extensions on each floor and one new added floor. The size of the extensions depends on the number of people and the type of family. For example, in some cases, when there are two families living in one house, or if there is one family and they have coaching classes at home, then two units combine sectionally through a staircase in the extension. So for all further references, the purple here is the existing building and the red is the retrofit addition. So this side of the ground floor in my design has typologies of houses which have shops in the front, which are shared between two houses. And this is my major takeaway from site, that there are coexisting programs. The shops are essentially just desks and there is no movement restriction and everything else comes and goes. You enter the building through the main spine, which has the staircase, which is existing, and the lift, which is a retrofit addition. You enter the first floor into something that I call the big living room. And I'll be zooming into this part to talk about it in detail. Learning from other case studies like the Poonawalla chawl, this new extension starts behaving as a big living room with no walls in between houses, a space where living can happen through the day. It also has various programs that the railing generates, which I'll come to later in the presentation. As one moves inside towards the existing building, the spaces of the house become more private, and the semi-private spaces like the kitchen are placed towards the big living room so that people can engage with each other at various points. The internal spaces of the house are designed as anchor objects, and the idea of architectural scale is reimagined by thinking of elements like lofts and some transforming furniture, which again I'll come to later in the presentation. Now in the section you can see that the new added floor over here tries to play with the volume with the intention of making it more radical and allowing a different way of life by working with levels as a principle and to avoid putting extra walls and letting maximum interplay happen within the house with the help of vantages and subtle allergies. It also tries to make the skyline more playful by making it dynamic in contrast to the current static one. As I mentioned, the railing is imagined as a space frame that can hold activities as well as objects and doesn't merely become a unifunctional element. There are nurseries, workspaces, gathering spaces, makeshift libraries that the railing generates. It also generates opportunities for nuanced activities like planting pots, altering one part of the grid by adding perforated screens, and using it as storage, and thus making the railing more dynamic. And it can change as and when people need it to change. The big living room creates various social engagements, borrowing from the site itself and Mumbai's diverse forms of living, other than the apartment at large. Other interplays, like for example, the corridor open space interplay, expand the spatial experience. The moment there exists interplay, two spaces start having an effect on each other, which generates opportunities to dwell and experience each space along with the form of the interplay itself. The bridge connects two neighboring buildings such that it creates a new ground for the people of BBD. Inside the house, the anchor objects are foldable and transforming, such that the study table becomes a seat for the dining table at some point, and so on, along with locks. So I would like to end by talking about how the lived experience of people would have drastically changed if the typology would have changed because of redevelopment. Retrofitting here allows for retaining the lived experience by adding a layer over the existing way of life rather than completely dismantling it. It adds a layer over the existing planned space with the aim to nudge it towards the lived space, which is actually the way people experience living, rather than creating a new planned space altogether. Yes, that's it. Thank you.
We have 2 minutes if any of the panelists would want to clarify something.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so just perhaps a clarification question that might or might not end up in discussion. I was wondering if you also were interested in or studied, the ways in which the project would be phased, owned, how is ownership orchestrated, how does construction kind of happen with people living or not living, ideas of like staging such a project, because it would entail different kinds of cooperative structures, different modes of organization that make it very different from any other normative process. I was wondering if the temporality of the project, if the making of the project was problematized in any form.
So yes, like I had thought about the staging of the project, but it wasn't resolved in detail. But there was an idea that if the top floor, the new added floor, is created first, then people can be slowly shifted to that floor, and the extensions on the floors below it should be done slowly and gradually. Yeah, and also about the costing of it. So there's a PWD board which takes care of those buildings right now and deals with the repairs, and it comes under MHADA, which is the Maharashtra Housing Board. So it has it talks about how it can repair and reconstruct buildings under it. So my whole idea was that some proposal can be made to them in order to reconstruct this building.
Thank you.
If there are no more questions, we can move on to the next presentation by Curated.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So hi, my name is Suchetan Sonawne, and my thesis topic is rethinking the idea of memorialization. So it is based on the current issue of statue building across the nation, and our government states that it is done to remember and commemorate our heroes, and it will also help in nation building. So my real concern is it the best way to commemorate someone or remember some great personalities? Statue building can provoke a certain kind of emotion within the citizens and communities, and this might lead to a conflict or a conflict between ideologies, and that can lead to compartmentalization within the communities itself. So and statue building is like 40,000-year-old art, And so what are we providing new to the space of art and architecture? And also we have thousands and thousands of freedom fighters and heroes to celebrate. So and also we don't have a measure to measure their accomplishment and achievements they have done for a society, and how can we decide their heights on their achievements. So sooner or later, our nation will be known as the statue capital of the world. So I've considered the upcoming statue of Baba Saheb Ambedkar in Indu Mills in Mumbai, and I'm trying to have tried to rethink the idea of a memorial for Baba Saheb, and to celebrate his achievements rather to celebrate him as a statue or a huge giant in which can make a huge giant in a society. So as we know, Baba Saheb Ambedkar is the chief architect of our Indian Constitution. He is the biggest social reformer and a great philosopher and a true nationalist. Because of him, many concepts like equality, human rights, women rights, and labor rights, and etc. People came to know about it, and also it were introduced in our constitution. He was also recently declared as the #1 scholar in the world by the Columbia University of New York. So he also greatly believed in education, science, and justice. So making a huge statue and making a giant in a society of Baba Saheb Ambedkar uh, will not be fair to his ideologies and himself. So I've tried to decode Baba Saheb Ambedkar, and I will celebrate his achievements rather than celebrating him, and I will celebrate his ideologies and his thinking through my program and the way of my architectural style and representation. So the program of my site of my project will be a think tank center. A think tank center which will consist of a huge public parliament, which will give us a common man a platform to come upon and debate upon several topics, several social topics, economical topics, or whatever topic which will lead to a better society. And in fact, the students will be welcomed, and it will be dependent more on students than on intellectuals. And in fact, and also many intellectuals, VIP activists will be invited for such an event and debate. So it will also, and this structure will also consist of a social media factory, which will cater to a social media platform, and which will burst the fake news currently happening within the society. And also it will consist of a huge library, a art gallery, and classrooms. So my site is near is Indu Mills, and it is in the Dadar precinct, and it is facing the Arabian Sea and the Bandra Worli sailing, and it is the current site where the Baba Saheb Ambedkar statue will be constructed. So I started with developing my site, started opening the access from each and every angle. So I started placing the public parliament in the basement, so it will be visible from every angle. So I also tried to place a huge amphitheater on the covering the uh, parliament over it, so that the huge performance area also and gathering space will be provided to the public. As you can see, this pink boxes, this pink are the vertical course. So this represents the four pillars of our democracy, which are equality, freedom, uh, liberty, and fraternity. And this masses and the spaces will be will be supported on these four pillars. As you can see, there is a particular sense of under construction and a sense of transparency within the society, and it also look very brutal in nature. I will come to it later. So my ground floor, as you can see in my ground floor plan, this space is completely private, and the outside space is completely public. So if any participant want to enter, he will directly enter in this space, and there is a huge cutout in which the ground floor can we can view to the basement, which is the Parliament area. So the VIP, it will be the ground floor will be consisting of VIP area and administration area and also rehearsal rooms. So as you can see on the first floor, these are the 4 cores, and this is the cafeteria, and this is fully for public. So this is the art, this is the viewing gallery in which common man also can visually interact and visually participate in the debate happening in the basement. And this is the basement plan. Yeah, moving forward. As you can see, as I said, there are 5 different type of activities happening in my program. So the first of all, the public parliament, which is in the basement, the library, which will be a huge library, which is the topmost level of the project. Topmost level in the project, which will be consisting of all the books written and read by Baba Sahib Ambedkar on economics, on politics, on sociology, and etc. This will be the social media factory in which it will lead the youth to come and generate more social media content which is based on true level of philosophy and true content, and which will be bursting the fake news currently happening in the society. This is the art gallery to display the previous debate happened in an artistic medium. And this is the classrooms in which a lecture will be happening on the further debate on which will span up to 1 or 2 weeks. So my main philosophy of this architectural construction was to celebrate Baba Sahib Ambedkar's biggest achievement, which was the Constitution. So in our Constitution, there is a freedom of access, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedom of expression in whatever sense, and there is a particular type of transparency, but this all freedom is supported from a particular framework, and that framework is our Constitution, and the 4 pillars will be supporting this framework. And also I've tried to achieve a new style of support system, which in which I'm saying this, everything will be hung from above. So everything is supported. So this is a reverse load transfer system. So if I want to in future connect a new volume in between, I can easily connect it through using suspension cables. And there is also many amphitheater within the volumes. So there is interaction in between and interaction between the volumes as well. As you can see, the parliament is in the basement. This is the first floor level in which the viewing gallery will be happening, and these are the volumes. So as I said, as you can see, this volume is very cuboidal shape. The outer facade will be having a LED lights, and it will be forecasting movies. We can watch. It will be forecasting cricket matches, and you can also celebrate our Independence Day, special days like Independence Day, Republic Day, and Baba Sahib Ambedkar's Jayantis. And also if I want to make a statue, I will in fact go for a very new entertainment platform, which is a holographic projection. So many countries are working on such kind of holographic projection. So I can in fact build a statue making a holograph of Baba Sahib Ambedkar. So this whole project is based on Baba Sahib Ambedkar's ideology, and it celebrates Baba Sahib Ambedkar. As I said, this structure looks like it is very under construction, and it is so I'm depicting our democracy and saying that it is always in a constant phase of development. It is not always constructed. So indirectly, this whole structure celebrates not only Baba Sahib, but every ideology which supports our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Suchetan. We can now have the questions from panelists.
Well, maybe I can ask a question. It's clarification, but it perhaps can be construed as critique. Why are you interested in still creating this kind of hagiography around Ambedkar, right? Why? I understand you're not making a giant statue, but you're still contributing to a kind of every single book that he's ever read in his life. So it's a kind of hagiography, right, of Ambedkar as a subject. Why?
So I'm not only celebrating Baba Saheb Ambedkar, but also various kind of other personalities. But also, if we always say we shouldn't construct a statue, so what is the alternative for it? What can be the best option to celebrate a personality? For me, this is the correct way.
But the question, I guess, is should we celebrate a personality at all? That's where I was going with that. But maybe
Yeah,
that's
so-
for the discussion.
Our current situation in India, we are inclined towards our past. We are always, this is a current mode. We are always thinking about our past and having a particular debate about
Why
it.
not a monument to the Constitution, just for example, right? Doesn't have to be about Ambedkar, but it could be about his ideas that are larger than Ambedkar himself.
Yes. So I have indirectly tried to say that only. Try to celebrate our constitution.
Yeah, we can continue such discussions in the latter part of the forum. We can now move to the third presentation. We have Nikita presenting for the third presentation.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Nikita Kulkarni from KRVI Mumbai, and my thesis is titled Peri-Urbanism Addressing the Politics of In-Between. Peri-urban is the third type of space between urban and rural and has its own identity and planning needs. This is an image of the peri-urban interface between Hubli-Dharwad. Hubli-Dharwad are the twin cities of Karnataka separated by a peri-urban landscape. While Dharwad is an educational, cultural, and administrative center, Hubli, situated 20 kilometers apart, is a trade, commerce, and IT hub. The aim was to direct the trend of development of Hubli-Dharwad towards each other and to ultimately have one continuous development. Hence, the government formed a new township called Navnagar in between Hubli-Dharwad. The Navnagar area has a government precinct and LIG, MIG, and HIG housing layouts. Since Hubli-Dharwad are twin cities, they come under a single administrative unit called HDMC, that is the Hubli-Dharwad Municipal Corporation. The local planning area of Hubli-Dharwad is greater than that under HDMC, which is administered by HDUDA, that is the Hubli-Dharwad Urban Development Authority. The HDMC has two headquarters, one in Dharwad, other in Hubli, and the HDUDA office is located in Navnagar. When we look at the organizational structure of HDUDA, it is clear that it has only land acquisition and town planning departments with zero involvement of the citizen body. Due to the interdependency of the two cities, around 2 lakh people travel to and fro on a daily basis. To cater to this, a BRTS system was established in 2018 that intersects the peri-urban landscape. The corridor extends from the central bus stop of Dharwad to that of Hubli with 33 stops, out of which the 12 BRTS stops are located in the peri-urban interface. The urbanization has taken place along the corridor in layers. Immediately along the corridor are the commercial developments like the industries, APMC market, the BMW showrooms, and petrol pumps, followed by the residential townships and villages, and then the extensive agrarian landscapes. These are the transects through every BRTS, all the 12 BRTS stops in the peri-urban. Each of them have a special condition, like the BRTS stop 1 has a lake on one side and a shopping mall on the other, or the 10 which has a forest on one side and industry on the other. This map shows the landmarks of the interface. This is the Navnagar government precinct, the APMC market that serves both Hubli and Dharwad, the new judges' quarters, and the industrial area. We can also identify around 5 transitional villages in the vicinity of the corridor. Mostly the developments that do not have space in the urban core have been transferred to the peri-urban. This is an analysis of the transforming landscapes over the year. Due to when the Hubli Dharwad highway was laid out, it divided the Raipur lake into 2 parts, and which is now affecting its relationship with the village. Here are other examples of how the farmlands were acquired to either build the judges' quarters, the industrial area, or the Navnagar area. Then the question arises, who has the power to define what a landscape should look like? The social composition of peri-urban is highly heterogeneous, with various stakeholders coexisting in the same territory, but with different and often competing interests in the peri-urban land. There are the farmers, the suburban migrants, the commuters, the informal settlers, the industrial entrepreneurs, the real estate developers, along with the religious trusts, the HDUDA, the HDMC, and village panchayats. This is a proposed development plan for 2031 by the HDUDA, and the hatched area shows the farmlands which are going to be acquired for capitalist interests. It is very clear that here the HDUDA has a hegemonic authority over the landscape identity of the peri-urban. Here are some of the protests that took place in response to this hegemony. The thesis proposes a new planning model for the peri-urban to be more participatory rather than authoritative, taking into consideration all the stakeholders involved. A shift from a typical pyramidal structure of governance to a rhizomatic structure of collaborative governance. The intervention is proposed at 3 scales. At the urban regional scale, a primary space for planning and decision making. At the neighborhood scale, a planning cell collaborating with the contextual government organizations, and at the smallest scale, creating open civic spaces for the immediate locality. The strategy was to extend the paraphernalia around the existing BRTS stops to create a new kind of a civic infrastructure. So the stop number 6 becomes a potential site for the primary planning center as it is located in the Navnagar government precinct. The stop number 4 and 8 are the proposed neighborhood planning cells located in the APMC and industrial area respectively. While all the other stops get extended with the open civic space, which may be in the form of an amphitheater, commuter shelter, garden, or a book pavilion. The thesis demonstrates the primary planning center in detail, and this is the program diagram for the same. These are the existing departments of the HDUDA, and the proposed departments are Citizen Information Cell, Transport Communication, Social Development, Environment, and Heritage Conservation. Each of the department extends into a public interface, like the Citizen Information Cell extends into a library of maps and data. The Town Planning Cell extends by exhibiting the recent and upcoming developments and physical models of new buildings. Transport and Communication has a citizens radio station, and environment conservation extends with a seed bank and a park, therefore making it a space of interest for all the stakeholders of the peri-urban. The site is located in the Navnagar government precinct and surrounded by the old HDUDA office, which is right now on the 3rd floor of the income tax office, the GST office, the RTO office, and the excise goods office. Here is the BRTS stop number 6. We can see that there's around 60 meters of unused open space, which is confined by a large compound wall. There is also a temple existing on the site. Basically, the intervention acts as a bridge connecting the 2 sides of the corridor and attaching to the existing BRTS stop, extending on this side to connect to the excise goods department. The right side of the bridge has more public programs, while the left begins with semi-public interactive programs leading to more private office programs. Since the slope decreases in this direction, the reservoir is built at the end of a bridge. The roofs are also designed in a way that the gutter carries the water to the phytoremedial reservoir, which is then supplied to the farmlands nearby. On the ground level, adjacent to the corridor on the right is a feeder service and parking facility, a farmer's market, a park, and the reservoir. To the left of the corridor is a large public plaza surrounded by the existing temple, the city museum, the city library, and a tower which is used to observe all the developments around. Here are a few department offices. This is the layout of the existing excise goods office. Due to the bridge, the major public influx happens on the upper level too. Therefore, the bridge is programmed to have an exhibition space, a bookstore, and extends on the right to have a cafeteria for the commuters and ends with a viewing deck. On the left, it begins with semi-public interactive programs like the Citizen Information Cell, the Seminar Room, and Citizens Radio. Another bridge that connects it to the remaining department offices. The roof, the terrace of the excise goods office is reused by building a metal roof over it. It has a large space for participatory workshops, a canteen, and at the interior are more private functions like the boardroom and other administrative offices. This section is through the Civic Plaza and the museum. The tower acts as a marker for the Civic Center and also a place from where the crowd of the plaza can be addressed. This section is through the BRTS corridor, showing the bridge with an exhibition space and its connection to the existing BRTS stop. This is a long section through the entire intervention. The terrace of the excise goods office is reused by a light metal roofing with solar panels over it. Materially, the programmed blocks are concrete, grounded structures which are interconnected by light metal bridges. But the concrete gutters run throughout, and the gargoyle pours the water into the collection tank, which then flows through the phytoremedial plant and is collected in the reservoir. This is a detailed wall section of a steel bridge with concrete gutter, and this is a wall section of a typical concrete block with planters. This is an exploded axo of the intervention, showing various interactions ranging from a public plaza to intimate discussion spaces, participatory workshops, and other recreational spaces. This was an attempt to design a kind of civic space that allows for many voices and functions, which then could act as a catalyst for resolving the conflicts of the peri-urban. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikita. Do we have questions from the panelists? If not, we can move to the fourth presentation. The next presenter is Fakin.
Hi, hello everyone. So my thesis is Klongsan District Office Public Space as a Democratic Infrastructure. This project is exploring the questions of how can experiences in public space affect our opinion of others. If we consider that a cohesive democratic society is not maintained by commitment to an abstract ideology, but to a repeated human interaction, whether it is a joint activity or just a passive acknowledgement of how others take part in the physical surrounding rather than digital environment. It could help neutralize our perceptions of others and influence us to be more understanding of others in our collective decision in a democratic process. But what about the current state of our social environment right now? So as our viewpoints become more and more polarized than ever, which correlates with the rise of digital interaction that promotes us a more global, convenient, and diverse gathering space, but instead it segregates us into our own echo chambers and reinforces us into the false consensus, which combined with an extremely car-oriented city like Bangkok, which significantly limits the exposure to the social environment in the city. And then where would we create that kind of place? So I begin looking at two quality to be concerned of in public space. First is the quality of being exclusive and inclusive, and the second is the space is this space require participants to put on a label on themselves to fit in. For example, you wouldn't be comfortable in a church if you are not label yourself as a Christian, which in ideal democratic public space, no one should have to put on a label to fit in. And governmental building is an interesting choice because everyone would have to be there for some bureaucratic reason and would have to fund it through taxation and making it unavoidably inclusive. Why it does not possess the same level of labeling as the other gathering space, which offer the potential for it to progress into a egalitarian gathering space. And as a democratic infrastructure, it should be a very localized to be seamlessly integrated into everyday life of its surroundings. And the district office is the smallest physical unit of Bangkok governing system, which make it interesting. And historically, Thailand place of governing have always been its communities gathering place, similar to any other region in this primitive time. But as governing have become more and more complex and bureaucratic, the more of the government building have been absorbed by the office space, and now it has almost occupied all of the space in the buildings. And as a contact with district office become more convenient due to technology, public workers and citizens the citizens that they are served have also become more detached from each other, which beg the question that if efficiency kill intimacy, what is the compromise? And Bangkok has 50 districts, and Klong San district is stand out because it is historically composed of many diverse communities, such as migrants from Laos and Malays Peninsula, while the community of Indian, Chinese, and European traders are settled nearby Pong Pajamit Fort, where they are directed to dock the trading ship there. And as Bangkok grows, the new addition of land development also add more of not only racial, but also generational aspect into the diversity of the district. And that is how to create a democratic infrastructure. And we want the project to attract many groups of people as possible. So the activity added to the project are explore and trace from the aspect of the context of user and surroundings, that they are participating in the same similar activity or participating together in the same activities. Those activities that are enjoyed by more groups of users will be more prioritized to be a part of the additional program into the district office. And these activities will be a medium between the diverse group of participants. And then the activities are categorized by the spatial flexibility. The rigid professional space, such as the office section of the district office, are broken down and decentralized, and they will be connected by a more flexible recreational space, which is the program that we are adding in to create an intersection between professional and recreational use of the buildings, and also between the public servant and citizen outside of the working environment. And all the space are shaped to be easily accessible as possible by a visual and circulation access, which is related to everyday use of the surrounding residents, and to become in order to become a space in community everyday life. For example, this access is connecting lower income housing around here in this area to the riverfront, which in Bangkok, the riverfront are increasingly become more privatized by luxury land development. So this access will provide the right of access to the river for the surrounding residential. And this access is connecting between lower income housing around here to the higher income housing around here. So these access are not only connecting between the surrounding context, but also crossing each other, creating another layer of exposure to the diverse group of the participants in the project. Yes, so this is my thesis. Thank you.
Thank you. We can move on to the last presentation.
I did have a clarification question just to understand. This is a new building, and what is the relationship to administration? Because you started with explaining administrative ideas with participation and then distance with digitization. So I'm curious to know, is this an admin building still, or is it just a public event space?
It is still administrative buildings.
Thank you.
We have the next presentation by Vatsal Shah.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Hello everyone. My name is Vatsal Shah. The title for my thesis is Reimagining the Sacred, the Case for Modern Conservation. The thesis tries to deal with the conflict between the terms modern and heritage in recent times, and also how urban evolution impacts the same. It attempts to address these issues by sort of exploring various architectural responses and possibilities. There has been a massive shift in the rate at which urban fabrics are evolving in present times. While the massive urge for development often tends to supersede the relevance of some of these build forms, there have been cases which have been lucky to escape the same and have been preserved as well. In both the cases, whether the build form achieves the status of heritage or not, the common phenomenon one experiences is of urban decay and the inability to deal with urban evolution with passage of time. So Rodrigo Perez, in his research, Urban Transformation, tried to ask these same questions, where the fundamental question was why urban design should sort of constrain for factors of change that come along with evolution in urban life. The project tries to seek these set of answers in the urban fabric of the city of Chandigarh, the city which has almost been frozen in the Corbusian memory and yearns for a new vision that can accommodate for the same set of urban evolution in the present time. So the site chosen for the heritage piece of city center in Sector 17 Chandigarh. This is the existing master plan of the site, wherein the yellow buildings are the mixed use ones. The orange ones are the government-owned institutes and offices. The red ones marking the single-screen cinemas at the site, and the blue ones are the underground parking. On the right are the few initial site analysis mappings. What is to note is the bottom two maps, which sort of show how pre and post working hours of institutes impact the magnitude of activity in the plaza itself. So the site is dominated by these 5 by 5 meters grid layout RCC structures, basically of three typology. as shown in the slide, with the outer circulatory core and number of floors varying in each other. What is to note is the height of all these build forms are same. The initial functional proposal was planned in such a way that each floor would be designated for a particular function. But what has happened over a period of time due to availability of the open grid and the individual circulatory cores, that has led to sort of creation of vertical societies in this build form. Now, what is interesting is the next key factor which has led, the key factor that has sort of impacted the site. It has been the shift of administrative magnets like district courts and various other government institutions and offices to the peripheral sectors or peripheral towns of surrounding Chandigarh. Also to note the deterioration of the existing cultural magnets, namely cinema, which has sort of left a functional void in the city center. So some of the key conclusion of my site analysis were how some of these build forms needed more porosity in terms of movement, how build forms sort of could extend to the plaza and create a new sort of relation with the public scape, how build forms needed to generate a sort of relation with public scape and not sort of limit their reach as individual build forms. These are the few images of how the existing site conditions look like. So yeah, the first step in the process is the master plan evolution for the entire city center. The first one being the existing master plan. So the first step that in the master plan evolution process is to sort of increase the reach of public scape by converting previous parking spaces or empty lands into the public scape of plaza. In the third step, the project sort of recognizes the open grid layout in the existing plan as an element that could act as a base for the new palimpsest layer of urban evolution by extending it throughout the master plan. In the fourth step, the new extended grid then could also be alternatively imagined as the reference for landscaping and planting of new trees across the site. The fifth step, additive transformation should happen in the entire master plan by addition of various new urban interventions and plugins that could go across the master plan. The sixth step is the final step of weaving that entire city center together by superimposition of new circulatory connectors over interventions across the site. The master plan evolution helps to generate a conceptual master plan for the city center as shown in this slide. The following 12 sketches are initial conceptual ideas for varied set of interventions across the site. Each one of them has been imagined as an outcome of its immediate surroundings and possibilities to activate new relations in their respective surroundings. What is important to note is the range of programs vary across the master plan in order to cater to wide range of users that visit the city center. The demarcated area is the one that I'm going to intervene through my project. So the building diagram is a direct result of the master plan evolution process itself, where it takes the grid as extended grid as the base for the palimpsest layer. The grid is then imagined as the reference for landscaping and planting of new trees. The functional masses then sort of carve out between these two superimposed layers, and the final layer being the directional walls, which are imagined to be the new circulatory directors that I was talking in the master plan evolution. So the concept of reurbanization of city centers is demonstrated through three different design strategies. First being the infusion of functional hybridity through the new infrastructure that is done through the Performing Arts Center. Second is the reviving of an existing magnet on the site that is demonstrated through the Neelam Cinema and its extension. The third being the reimagination of the hierarchy of the plaza itself by through different public interventions across the plaza. Starting with the first one, the Performing Arts Center. The Performing Arts Center is imagined to fill that functional void that, as I mentioned before, by the cultural and administrative magnets by introducing new sets of programs and users to the site, thus diversifying the functional output of the city center and helping it evolve its past identity of being just an administrative magnet. The build form then embraces the idea of landscape and functional spaces being interwoven into each other and also sort of invites the public scape to thrive on top of it. What is key to note, the build form also responds to its immediate surrounding RCC build forms by utilizing the dysfunctional spaces available in them and trying to sort of create a relation with them as well as the public scape that is there. The zoomed in plan exactly shows how the new build form sort of places in with context to the RCC build forms. The following are the program list which go inside the Performing Arts Center. The zoomed in section shows how exactly the new build form sort of appropriates the dysfunctional spaces in the RCC build forms, but also sort of utilizes the same circulatory core as well, and allows the public scape to sort of pass through it or interact through it. In that process, sort of generating porosity that I was mentioning, and by allowing public scape to sort of thrive through it. In order to further implement the idea of landscape and build form being interwoven into each other, varied junctions across the master plan are detailed out in order to create a network for channelizing rainwater on the site, either by collection or either by recharging of the groundwater. So the sectional perspective view below is cut through the Neelam Cinema extension and all the other public interventions in the plaza. So starting with the second part of design strategy, the Neelam Cinema and its extension. The main intent for the extension was not only to provide new screening spaces which go below, but also to create a relation with the public scape provided by the plaza, which is done via an open performance space imagined on top of the new extended wing. The third part of the design strategy being the public interventions in the plaza. Starting with first one being providing space and temporal infrastructure to sort of enable setting up of weekly bazaars or open exhibits that could go across the city center. The next one being Water Plaza, which shows how an existing landmark, in this case in the form of the public fountain, could be reimagined by additive transformation and creation of hierarchy in the plaza around it. The Tower of Change is sort of imagined as a temporal space that allows for material experimentation, also acting as a marker on the site and keeping the efforts of additive transformation alive. The last one being the huge vehicular passages that cut through these build forms across the master plan could be then imagined as pedestrian drop-off points or entry points for pedestrian access into the city center. So I would like to end the slide with some of the cross sections of my entire project, which show how the new and the old layer sort of interact and generate a sort of new vision for the city center. And to end with, I would like to end with a few lines by Rodrigo de Perez. What the modern plan calls for is a vision for continuity and not just a discourse between the past and the present. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vatsal. I hand over the mic to Shubhra ma'am to moderate this discussion further.
Thank you. Before we get into the discussions, were there any specific clarification questions for Vatsal? Since we didn't give the 2 minutes. But if there are none, we can sort of begin. I'd like to begin really by reminding the panelists, in a sense, that what we have seen and the purpose for which we have gathered here really is also to reflect a little bit on as a group of these 5 projects, how do we begin to talk a little bit about the current concerns through these 5 projects that seem to be going on in schools of architecture, and certain sort of implicit biases of the profession of what I like to call creative isolation. I think we would all agree that the 5 projects that we saw, many of them are definitely trying to question what the extent of the project is in terms of its impact beyond a site or a plot boundary, which a lot of other projects and architectural practice does suffer from. But it always seems to run into the sort of assumption and paradigm of the architect almost using the context to showcase their expertise. And in that sense, I mean, they make statements which are closures in themselves, as though having addressed a situation architecturally, we have solved the problem. There is, and this is not really for the presenters as much as the sort of bias of our profession. So I would like to sort of course, each of you will bring your insights into specific projects as well as the common discussion. But this is something that has that I have been observing both in the previous panel discussions, but in the way architectural schools function. The second that I would like to bring back from the previous panel discussion, should the four of you be interested in sort of thinking about this and maybe including it in the conversation, is also again this innocence is what one of the panelists call, but sometimes I feel is it also a kind of a creative entitlement. However we sort of term it, but this idea of an indeterminate public space, the idea that you build it and they will come. It is not actually isolated just in architectural practices, but in nonprofits as well, or in universities as well. As soon as they want to give a boost to their organization or their institution, they will say, let us build a new building, and that excitement will generate and propel the mission of the organization forward. So I would just like to throw that in the mix as well. To the panelists, to the co-panelists and student presenters, I would really like to thank you that you've offered your projects up for these discussions. And I hope that the panelists will be able to use your projects as to illustrate certain points. But to all of you, don't expect specific crits only on your project. So these questions are also in that spirit of opening up rather than being only responsive to statements that have been made so far. And so yeah, those were two things that perhaps I thought I would throw in the mix, since we see it repeated in project after project. And the last, of course, is I think something Sarosh brought up, which was also brought up by people like Hubert Murray in the previous discussion, is the whole notion of ownership as something that implies time beyond completion. And ownership is not just about private ownership, but if we are talking about now the commons, then the idea of what sustains the commons, what is that accountability and responsibility rather than ownership, and tied to creative authorship, which again suffers from the same thing, where so many times we associate authorship with reputation, and we assume collaboration is a dissolution of authorship. But if we can perhaps look at it in terms actually of authorship as a way to ensure accountability and responsibility rather than reputation. So with that, I invite our four just absolutely wonderful and interesting practitioners to jump in, please, and take it from here. Yes.
Yeah. Shubhra, I think that's a very, very good introduction to our discussion. The school, or the academic space, the university, should be, in my view, the counterpoint or the opposite of the world. It should raise questions about the world. Now, in order to do that, it sometimes would have to reverse the methods that are current. Not just take up issues which are calling for attention, but the processes by which something happens. And I think what I see in all the 5 projects really is a belief in totalization, in the large, very large scale, in the centralized, in the kind of architecture that needs a huge amount of investment. And therefore, the objectives of each project, wonderful as they are, become the opposite of what they're trying to do. The architectural result tends to become the opposite of what they began to do. So for example, in the Charles project, would it have been better to make kits for the inhabitants to extend and change their own house rather than to have a larger grip on the total, for example? And this applies to each of the projects. The second one, for example, reminds us of the projects of the Soviets in the early, the constructivist projects, where there was a sense that propaganda will change the world. And propaganda went wrong because propaganda has to be handled by somebody. And so there again, the very purpose of the project goes astray because of the hugeness of what would it be if there were small teams, for example, doing many things in different parts of India. Like that, I think every single project shows an innocent belief in the administration, which is a good word for the power structures, really. It's never innocently administration. And there is a great deal of belief in that, which leads to finally what happens to the architecture. It becomes devoid of substance. Every drawing shows a kind of schematization and lacks the ability to absorb life. It doesn't have a sense of life. It has a sense of being built, and being built with the most neutral materials. And I think there are questions which are raised by the drawings as much as by the thought process. And it might be an interesting thing for schools to question whether we need large projects, whether it is okay for a final project to be a tiny project, which is actually done in the community. Would it be acceptable? And I think much of the questions are because the university authorities or the schools demand a certain scale. And there, I think there is a great change required. So I'll stop there. I've taken quite a bit of time. Sorry about that, but I thought one had to look at the whole circle.
Well, I could take on that, and I agree with Professor Chaya and I think that I could think of going even beyond. I mean, one of the things is what is the expression of the architecture, and what is that expression giving? No, like we're questioning the idea of monumentality, of monuments as statues for people, but we're doing a huge monument for its work. No, so that is one thing, or it's the same with questioning the ceremonial religious space or the governmental expressions in the continuity of the two cities program or in any project. I see it less in the extensions of the housing, but again, I also see it, no? But I think, why don't we question the role of the architect? Can't we just start to understand that we also could play a role equally as the people that are going to there, as going to use a space? And we think that those negotiations can happen instead of the imposition of the architect being the one that plans the whole structure, the whole example, central houses, the city way we remember. I said I would like to then think that we could question that the architect is not the sole entity that can think on the production of space. So how can we socially include other voices, other people to production? And this way, I think could change, because otherwise we're still being one of those people that are was entity.
Yeah, I think we might have lost Tatyana, but it sort of, in a way, also harks to some of the questions Sarosh had raised during the Chawl project renovation in terms of was time problematized in the making? And it goes back to what Professor Chaya was saying as well, that as soon as, for instance, if we shift our allegiance from a central authority that is funding our projects and therefore everything will go smoothly, to let's say the group of people we are building amongst, even funding as an imagination might trickle in. Therefore your practice has to respond to that. So right. Rather than an abstract, so it kind of ties back to, I think, also what Chaya was saying, of a belief in a certain totalitarianism. That if we just shift, even in our imagination as a story, who our allegiance lies to. And I think it also then ties back to how Gautam practices in terms of settlements. So Sarosh and Gautam, while we wait for Tatyana to back in.
I'd like to, I very much like the note that both you and Professor Chaya started with and what Tatyana was saying. I have to say, I enjoyed many things about these presentations and these projects, and thank you for them. It's really nice to see architects pushing, like Shubhra was saying, the plot boundary, to see a kind of publicness being fought for and sought for, to go, it's very nice for me to sit in an architectural presentation and not have to think about aesthetics only and be asked, mostly because I'm completely, as a non-architect, incapable of having any response to those. So I want to talk, I think the comment I want to make to open with is to think about this idea of the public that underlies this notion of publicness and public space that you're all trying to create. I think the public is a very interesting and contested history in cities. The Paris boulevards that created a certain kind of public were made to hold the width of 2 tanks so that Baron Haussmann could crush popular revolt. Remember that Cairo gathered in Tahrir Square, not because anyone designed Tahrir Square to be a Midan for protest. It was a traffic intersection that became a space for protest. Right? I think for Delhi, one of the best things that happened to us is when Jantar Mantar got banned temporarily as a space for protest, because we were forced to go back to other streets instead of a designated place to perform citizenship and dissent. So think about publicness is that the minute you can control it, it ceases to be democratic. And I want you to think a little bit about the fact that the title of this session was conflict. And actually what Professor Chaya is also saying is, where's the conflict in your work? Where's the tension in your work? There's a lot of certainty. And I think, that, and certainty is, and I think if you go back to Shubhra's question about practice and our education, we, in all our disciplines, are taught to constantly demonstrate certainty and expertise and never doubt.
Absolutely.
And I think we do our students and ourselves such a disservice that I've never seen a presentation that says, here's a blank space in the middle of this sheet, because I don't know what to put in there. I don't know what goes here. I don't know what should happen. And in that, I don't know, is the space for possibility and making and change and conflict, right? Remember, the sound of a totalitarian society is silence, not protest.
Well said.
Conflict is a sign of healthy, noisy democracy. So Chetan, what we're struggling with in this moment, there's no noise in our cities to what's happening. It's not that they're getting along. And so the thing that discomforted me a little bit is when you were over deciding public spaces, there were spaces of consumption and leisure. And when did performing arts centers become so democratic? When did the idea of the shared plaza suddenly become so automatically emancipatory? The true public spaces in Indian cities are spaces of production. They're vending zones and waste picking sites. That's where people actually gather and work together. So I was really struck that when we seek to make the public, we seek to make controlled spaces where citizens behave, that they don't mess up regulations and occupy streets and have businesses, right? So Vatsal, I was very intrigued that you put in the middle of that center an informal market. Remember, if you directly put a market in a planned space, there's nothing informal about it. If you just mean that it's scaled differently, that doesn't make it informal, right? And I think, so Chetan, I was thinking, there are many statues you can fight against, but an Ambedkar statue in India has a different symbolism to just spectacle, right? Remember, the Ambedkar statue stands in small gullies and small lanes and in neighborhoods as defiance. It's not the same as the statue we built in the sea in Gujarat. So I would be easy to think about that spectacle. I totally agree about the scale of that project. I was thinking, most housing in India is built very slowly, brick by brick. You know what an under construction memorial could be? It's when the concrete rods are sticking out of an concrete. That's what under construction is. I would have loved if you said, here's a foundation, here's some underground construction. Everyone come and get a brick and decide what to put. Make the thing together. That's what would make it public. People would agree and disagree. So I think that, if you talk about the public in context of deep structural inequality, they've got to promote more conflict, not just less, and not conflict in its negative sense, in its democratic sense. And the more these spaces are controlled, the more the public is reduced. So Sanya, Lefebvre didn't just talk about abstracted space. He said abstracted space is the result of a certain capitalist logic of the way space is valued. Right? So you can't just take lived and abstract space and take out the political economy of where he was writing from. What is the value of this land, right, next to the BRT station? What is the political economy of a BRTS project between two cities? Why is that station not becoming a civic center? Because the intention is not to build the civic. It is to build a land market and an economic form of a certain kind. So I think that if we're going to challenge ourselves, we need to be one more actor in messy, conflicted publics with far less certainties and a far greater attentiveness to the political economy of that power. What spaces allow contestation, enable and support contestation precisely from those who don't have power and capital? And that's the thing I'd like you to think through a bit as you're reaching to the public.
And as architects, we are always negotiating, mediating. That's just what we do, or we are trained to do but we're trained to do it in a very specific and in a very kind of disciplinary. Is opening up is absolutely a more open-ended, a more, perhaps even more vulnerable position for ourselves. But I just want to say, Gautam, I hope I didn't cut you off. So I hope you were finished. Okay. I just want to say how how incredibly accomplished your projects were. I think that has to be said. These projects are really, really well accomplished. So, you know, the representations from every normative standpoint. So I will not speak to how great they are because they're beautiful projects. But I think that they open up, as has been said, different ways of thinking about the discipline and the profession. And one of the things that that has been sort of absent from a lot of this discussion is the question of labor. And I say labor specifically here. I was reading this book called The Details of Modern Architecture by someone called Edward Ford. And Ford says that modern architecture has always privileged the users of architecture, right? So we make drawings, we make representations, and we present the building as a fait accompli, right? And it lands on site, but we do not problematize enough the processes by which it is put together, right? And so if you were to start thinking about labor in that sense, and so then in Details of Modern Architecture, you know, the rise of ornament and labor as people who build. So the 18th century, 19th century architect built for and with the people who were building. And I think that has been completely lost. So we never ask ourselves, almost never ask ourselves, who is it that will make these buildings? Who is it that is the participant? And I almost detest the use of the word public, because which publics? Who is the public? You know, and especially in a place like India where the public is so contested, which publics? There is a certain kind of neutrality and a certain kind of assumption that is just afforded with the use public, as in public means good. No, public isn't good, because oftentimes public is just a certain kind of person who can use a certain kind of space. And increasingly, we are also seeing a certain kind of a way in which publicness is not afforded, especially to you know, the people who need it the most, perhaps. And so I think that tying in the question of process of building something, and then process, like Professor Chaya was saying, the processes by which we implicate other sites, contexts. So absolutely working in a community, and then not confusing the question of scale with the question of complexity, because you can do a very small project and it can be incredibly complex, right? So I think the question of scale is really a good one, because if you thought about labor and you thought about process and you asked yourself, how am I going to put this thing together? But not in a kind of practical way, like not in a purely practical way, but in a way by how do I marshal resources? You know, what are the ways in which a practice can become a project? That would produce a different, because then you would study the Ambedkar worship in these small chawls, and you would study the ways in which Ambedkar has been become a bit of a saint, you know, in all of these chawls. And you would ask yourself, well, he was all for a democracy of a certain kind, and you would then flip the question on itself, and maybe these would become smaller, more democratic memorials, and you wouldn't end up with this like giant monument to Ambedkar. I do love the idea of not building a statue, but of course, you know, it reminded me so much of these presidential libraries in the US, where you know, every single book that the president has read is in this tomb. Nobody goes there, and definitely few people, only researchers who are interested in Eisenhower will, like, you know, pull that book out. So perhaps you were more participatory in your approach. I did like the insinuation that project had with something like the Fun Palace, where the Fun Palace is again process driven. It is all about temporality. It is all about a building that can keep shift. It's a shapeshifter almost, right? And I think that, again, if we talk about process in this way that we are according agency, not just to ourselves, but to others, then our projects are better received. So we'll leave it at that.
Tatyana, we lost you midway, so I'd love you.
I know.
To...
It was very frustrating. Sorry, and I don't know how it continued the conversation for 5-10 minutes. But anyway, I was trying to question the role of the architect, and I guess that Gautam took on that because I heard the last minutes of his intervention. But I think that beyond also that, I was thinking that we should definitely put on the table again the possibility of the understanding of the program, not only the question of the architect, but why do we continue thinking that we need in urban strategies a museum and a library and a place to gather, such as a forum? I mean, can't we open also that possibility into the social production of the ideas of the spaces that are not that don't need labels? That I'm kind of questioning even that. So I think that the human to human topic brings us to that possibility, because if not, it's the architect to the user. Now that Charles was saying the user, and if it's the human to human, then we should be really including that other human, and not hierarchizing the possibility of the architect and the user.
Yes.
I don't want to sort of take up too much space or time, but I think Tatyana hinted in her first set of comments about materiality, and I think this is something which we, even though if it sounds old-fashioned, and the architectural language of today does not allow us to talk about space or material qualities and so on, I think it is necessary. Because if you look at any great change that happened in society, it happened with a different view of material. For example, if we don't build a new view of waste, then we are not going to be the society that respects all. If we are going to look at materials in hierarchies, then we are going to go increasingly towards neutralizing all surfaces so that they do not offend. Whereas the rudeness of the Indian city comes out of the fact that different people know different things, and they do it in their own ways, and they have access to different modes of material, and they also have access to different kinds of skills. And any large project which unifies that, such as the Chandigarh project, is bound to create the notion of a from above and not from. There is not an effervescence, but there is a total. And the other thing is that the kind of space that you will get is the space in which everything is visible. All human beings are on display. If you go to a mall, that's one of the things that they do, that you are on display, therefore you will have to wear branded clothes, etc. I can't imagine Digambar Sadhu walking through a mall, which I can in the street. I can't imagine one of those Hanuman type fellows walking through a mall. They'll never let him in, of course. But the public space, which does not suggest a particular model of existence, is a space which is made by many different actions and many kinds of materiality and many kinds of labor, as Sarosh quite clearly said. And I think this is missing from the way we draw now And I wonder whether it is possible to start making not just the messier urbanism that Gautam is asking for, but the messier drawing as well. Because if your drawings do not capture that quality of, then we are only going to make malls of democracy, where democracy is in display for you to consume. There won't be anything further. So I think this diversity of material is something which would be, and of space, where you can hide, where you're not seen all the time, where there are intricacies, where everything is not opened to such an extent that all the time you feel,
yeah.
So that's what I'll stop there.
Yeah.
We have not allowed the students to talk at all, but we have a lot to talk about still. So Gautam, yes.
No, I wanted to make a very brief comment on this idea of hiding. There is a Dalit queer geographer called Dhiren Borisa, who I would really recommend to you. And and as someone who grew up as a gay man in an Indian city, this idea that the public has to be a place where you must also be able to hide.
Yes.
That it cannot be this. It must, remember, we also come, I go back to the question of the public in a context of structural inequality, gendered, caste, and religious based, has to play different functions than a simple idea of an Athenian plaza where the demos meets. Like that can't be the legacy of our public. Our public, and and I think and I'd love, say, Sanya, when you pick up that notion of that the corridor is a kind of home and private, semi-private public space in the chawl, right? But extend that to the city as well in the other project. Think of those kinds of private, semi-private spaces in the city as well. Think of other archives. So one of the things to say is, how could we, one of the questions I think to think curricularly is, what are then the other forms of data we should look at?
Yeah.
What other archives should we be reading when we think about our practices? Desire is a fantastic archive to look at the city, to look at inequality. Where can I walk? Who can I be? Where can I be free of violence? Can I be unafraid to stand in the public spaces of my own city? Where can I work? Where can I vend? Where can I pick up? Where can I breathe? So I think if you think about, if we look at other kinds of desires, that will give us other starting points. I think none of us are trying to sort of say, look, there is a top down and here's a bottom up. That's romanticization on both sides. Real inequalities need articulations and practices at multiple forms of scales. But let's look at spatial practices, very particularly as spatial practitioners, and say people do make spaces, even in our inequalities, right? They occupy land. Yeah. They sell on streets. They walk, any kind of green park in India has that one strip of brown in the middle where everyone has walked one after another, right? No one wanted us to walk there, and we all walked there. And now we've claimed that space. So Michel Desserteau's work, right? Walking as tactic, as strategy, as resistance. Shilpa Phadke's work on thinking about loitering and sleeping in the afternoon, napping. Can we suggest, if I think a little bit about Dhiren Borisa's work, about what it means to be a small town migrant Dalit queer person embodying Delhi, what is that space? What is that publicness, those moments that are created? Can we look at other kinds of data and archives of different kinds before we start designing, and I think I can see all of you drawing from these. I mean, I have to say, in all these projects, the references you draw, Fatin, your idea about the unmarked, unlabeled space is very core to theories of citizenship about when do I become unmarked, right? But resistance is also about being marked when you want it to be, right? The term of self-assertion. So we can't be stripped so cleanly of our markings. We do take our identities into space, right? And they do cut across in all those ways. So what if we, in order to reimagine a certain spatial practice, and I'm using the word particularly following Tatyana, not an architectural practice, a spatial practice that is as sensitive to the production of space in terms of labor and process and identity and political economy. What if we started saying, how does public space get created in our cities? It's not in the malls. Professor Chaya is totally right, right? But so are people occupying land? What does occupation do to architectural practice? What do street vending markets have to tell us about how space is designed and moved and people circulate? So can we begin from a different archive? And then what would that give us? I think that all these projects make me want to go further into those archives, which is my greatest compliment to them, right? You're trying to invert it. And I hope you guys keep pushing those archives, but it will require you not just to rethink scale and certainty and methods. It will require you to look differently and read and listen differently and read from different archives. And I think architectural education, to go back to Shubra's question, must offer you an opportunity to get to those archives. That must be part of our spatial education. Because until it is, it will be unfair to ask of that. So that has to be offered. And I think there are many places, I know of these schools, I know the School of Environment and Architecture the most, and I sense the difference in those archives, in that building. And I think it's a very welcome shift that's happening across in places in many ways. And I hope we see more of it.
Do our participants, Tatyana, please. Yeah, absolutely.
Comment. Yes. Yeah, for me, it's exactly that, no? For me, the 20th century was about the idea of democracy and equality for all, although we didn't achieve it. That was the 20th century, no? But that was clearly the reflection of how architecture worked. And that homogenized the way we live, the way we act, the way we should act, the way we should live, rather said. And I think that right now we should look for how, yes, of course, we accept the differences, no? How can we accept diversity as a fact? And diversity cannot be decided by one person, because that is not, it's an impossibility, no? We need to really include everybody. So each of them could be represented in a space that it's public, but also that is domestic and is as private as possible, you know? So I think the question for me in these present times is how can we act as an agency that could create a platform that would include the possibility of each of us to be represented, you know? So include their own thoughts, their own ways, their own possibilities, and their own options and ideas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can I just say, and I'll keep it really short. I think as educators and people who construct syllabi, since the projects raise these questions, we cannot escape politics, and we cannot allow our innocence, our neutralities, our openness, which is oftentimes it comes from a good place, but we should be aware of how neoliberalism and default kind of capital will always subvert these unless we have thought about them, unless we have thought about the underpinnings of the projects that are embedded in certain forms of resistance. And I think that this understanding of resistance in representation, in origins of what we do, is something that we need to talk about as educators as well.
Would any of the presenters like to jump into the conversation? Some thoughts that have come up in your mind now that yes, Sania, please.
So I wanted to talk about the public and what you were discussing about the public. So this is something that I experienced while working on the thesis. So in the start, when we're going to site and we're talking to people, I feel that act is very important according to me, because what happens there is as soon as you hear different set of people from all different sections of society talking about their life or talking about their everyday, then there is a construction of these different stories that take place for you as a person who is going to listen to them. And I think that helps to distinguish, like break down the public and not let it remain as this one whole big entity hovering over your head. Or then also it's kind of easier to do it in the start of the project. Then you will go and you will talk to people, you will try to understand them. You reach a certain point, but after that what happens is you come back and then you feel detached, like it's a constant conflict that you're trying to think of what you spoke to people about on site, but when you're coming back, it's almost as if it's a blanket you're throwing over it, even though your intervention is responding to it. In your mind, it's very difficult to look at them as threads because you're supposed to bring everything together and give a concrete solution to. It's often looked at as a solution rather than a response, and that is when it becomes A and B and not anything in between that. I just wanted to add that which I reflected on my own process while like working on it.
If I can add to that, I think I can relate to what Sanya was speaking about. While even side analysis, like you see these temporal sort of public actors which are there at some times but which are not there. So when you sort of try to relate to them at some specific point of time, but then their description of space that they actually sort of dwell for or imagine for is not nothing which is something static. It's like in the morning he might be standing next to, he's a chai wala and he's standing somewhere else where he's comfortable, and in the evening he's kind of standing somewhere else where he sort of accommodates his space automatically without even sort of concern for what specifically he sort of imagines the space that he wants to set up his stall at. And also how these informal markets are set up, it's very dynamic. Like for me to sort of bring out a solution, it almost becomes A and B, but then it's not about A and B. Their space is more than more organic and more dynamic in that sense. So yeah, I sort of relate to that point.
So this thing that you're talking about this activity that changes to the day, that is another conflict that arises when you try to programmatize something. Like I tried to study all these different housing typologies and how things happen in there every day. There are no names for those things that are happening every day, but like the process that you're trying to get away from, but it's still there in you, is to give a name or form like a group of things. Only then you can respond to it, because otherwise it seems like it's very complex and then you can't respond to each and everything. So then you tend to group those things together into a program or an umbrella under which you will then start designing. So, but that's not how it works in the everyday that you observe. So that's a constant conflict that you have to engage with.
So even sort of grouping informalities it's a big task. You can't directly sort of say that what is informal. If those informal actors are the most active actors at the site, the formal sector is not that active or not that the factor which why the public sort of visit the city center itself. So the question is then what is informal and what is formal?
It's also a problem of our lens again, because we are so trained in this kind of enlightenment view that everything is a binary. You know, it's either formal or informal. But what if it is the same at different times, or you know, a bit of both? You know, we're trained in this like black and white reading of plans. You know, Noli's plan of Rome is as far as it goes, where, oh my God, we've like now drawn plans for where we would have drawn Porsche. That's a big deal. But you know, it's all in our training that we are trained to constantly say it's public or private. You know, that's where I feel like we have to, and I totally agree with I think it was Gautam or Tatyana who said that we have to move away from this labeling. And I think that's also what Sanya and Vatsal are saying, that, you know, this idea that everything must exist in a label and permanently so. That's kind of, you know, that immediately precipitates a certain conceit, which it can be very problematic. There is a lot of chatter in the chat window.
Yes. So there are some questions that are coming up as well from from the audience. Some are very long, but I'll try and go through a few of them. The first one is addressed to Professor Chaya, but I'd encourage everybody else to jump in as well, because I think the conversation went where everyone was sort of talking or alluding to it. And it says that you mentioned the need to embrace the diversity of material and space. Would this in turn call for reinterpreting the act of designing and building through the lens of spontaneous order? It's
a good question. I would say, rather than think about spontaneity, I think the whole, we were taught that architecture solves problems, and you proceed from A to B to C, and then you the problem, and this is of line of I can see
you're breaking up quite a bit.
Yes, not because that school is demanding that there must be that solution, but the entire system of thought about education requires us to have the solution. And I think that is where material can free us from that. And the sort of, what do they call it? I think Joyce called it the hand-to-hand fight with reality. That, if it happens, then you got a slightly different possibility. The example is that Gandhi worked only on materials. He said, you clean the shit, you work with cotton, you work with leather, you work with food, and all the time, the majority time of his day was spent with material. So that there wasn't that kind of a vague sense of spontaneity otherwise.
Yeah.
It comes, I think the real question is, how do you keep on encountering the world where our tools are so different? Because we have to draw, which already distances us, and then we have to draw on a screen which makes me, I'm not saying it's bad, I use it, but that's where the problem is. Yeah. Sorry. Took a long time.
No, more than that, you were breaking up, so we were all really trying to sort of hear what coherently. Sarosh, you raised your hand.
No, I was just, because you were breaking up, it allows me to misinterpret what you were saying. So thank you for that. But no, I love this notion of materiality, especially your reference to Gandhi, because I think in architecture school, materiality has this phenomenological impetus. And I think it's very clear from the way in which you're talking about it and the example again of Gandhi, that we have to understand the political agency of materiality, right? And that is where you cannot divorce materiality from questions again of labor and practice and process and ecology, right? And this is where I think, again, the phenomenological construct of it was all about a certain kind of, tactility and phenomenology. And I use phenomenology here deliberately so because it is so pervasive, in our understanding of like Louis Kahn and the brick and, this idea of fetishizing materials, which is, we were all raised like that. And we accept that as important and an essential construct of architecture. But in doing so, the materiality is reduced to its one-time location in the building, but how it was put there, what were the damages done in putting it there, it's extractive, exploitative, caste-based agendas are not problematized. And as someone is saying in the chat window, Kashigar, thank you. is that we are woefully ill-equipped in a studio to take all of these questions on. And I think that's, perhaps we can address one or two of them, but I just want to draw the distinction between these two views of material constructs.
Yeah. There is also, I think, when we are talking a lot about the limitations of an architectural studio, but there are also certain opportunities, I suppose, if sometimes parallel lived experiences inform the process. And what I mean by that, it reminds me of a studio where we were critiquing the SEPT campus master plan, and this notion of openness and certain open plan and what it means, et cetera, et cetera. And throughout the 14th semester, an underlying exercise for the student was to document, for the group of students, 12, how their particular studio space was being used, because every 2 weeks their process was changing. Initially they might have been working on a little thing, then maybe making a bigger model, et cetera, but the space given to them by the administration was a very arbitrary ad hoc square foot per student. And the negotiations they had to do with their fellow studios, because there were 4 studios in this in the space, was questioning their innocent belief in negotiation and collaborations always going right. So to sort of tie back to some of the conversations we are having, and to Sanya and Vatsal's sort of point that, we talk to all these different people in the beginning of the studio, users, this, that, and the other. We realize that the landscape is quite diverse. It's not a homogeneous block of public. But when we come back to the studio, just the process and the isolation, either you have to be incredibly creative to weave stories of conflict, but your design process doesn't actually encounter resistance, which, so in just the students having to negotiate their spaces in the studio and not take the space that the administration gave them for granted, they began realizing that even collaboration and negotiation itself is a creative act, because sometimes you fight with your fellow students, sometimes you cajole, and these experiences then feed the kinds of design decisions you're taking architecturally, because now they have a certain embodied knowledge that is feeding their design process. So perhaps opening up the design studio, if not to a real situation, but in some way to include their daily their daily lived experience, and push that a little bit to generate these questions that otherwise we normalize, and then our architecture tends to normalize as well. I did want to ask Tatyana, since she has been very intentional in talking about the manner in which she draws, to leave open, to actually resist making statements and leave open possibilities, that perhaps, since we have touched on that in terms of being a little wary of certainty in your process, if you can talk a little bit of that as well.
Well, I think that for me, still that is an open question on how to do it, but certainly interacting as, or acting as one of the persons who's going to be part of that change, a productive change of the production of any space, it's been helpful. And how, like, by stepping back and by listening, and by not in every project is possible. So that is for me what I'm saying, that it's still an open question. I haven't achieved it. But for example, for me, it was very important to understand, and when we were doing the reconstruction of the earthquake in Mexico, and how to step back as the only person who has the solutions, no, and how to really listen to the dwellers. And there were people that decided to build houses without windows. For me, it was totally inconceivable. But these people were really afraid of having a window in a room where it would be facing to the most unsafe street that in the town was there, because their plot was there. And for me, that was the first moment I really stepped back. And they built their house, and that room has no windows. And for me, it was really inconceivable. But it's their house, it's their decision, it's their place. For me, it was, I was only part of that group helping them to build their house, and they did build their house. So we achieved the objective.
Yeah.
And for me, it was inconceivable. For us, was inconceivable to have a window there. So we need to stand in those places. We need to stand in a point where there's people that think completely the opposite on what you think, and guess what? They coexist with us.
Yes.
So how can we really negotiate there? There's no negotiation. There's only the possibility of us becoming part of that change.
Yeah. And it sort of points to a
Maybe.
very
for me, still a very open, big question.
Yeah, but what you raised is also really important, that the role of the architect and the imagination, the architectural imagination, has to respond to the paradoxes, specificities, call what you may, of that specific context. So that the role of the architect is not one consistent across projects. So sometimes if you are there only to enable building, then you do step back, as you said, when it deals with other things. That ties to a question that came up to Dr. Bhan, but again, it's really anyone who feels like jumping in. It's a little long, so please bear with me. Dr. Bhan, you pointed out that the publicness or commons occur in the in-between spaces that aren't controlled, but the uncontrolled natural or neutral spaces are as representative of our society, highly biased spaces which privilege the heterosexual, fully abled, young, upper middle class, male performative individual. As designers of the built environment, how do we approach design so as not to over-design, not to take away authenticity, yet counter the unfortunate imbalances of our society, which do not give women, elderly, children, lower castes, and those on the spectrum the freedom to hide? I think he's wondering, I think he or she, in terms of how do we go about doing this?
Yeah, no, I just read this question in the chat actually, and I think it's sorry, it took me a second to remember that I was Dr. Bhan.
Gautam.
I always look for my father when someone says that. So I mean, I just read this in the chat as well. So I think let me look at it a little different way. I don't think those spaces are either uncontrolled or undesigned, which are the words that are in the question. I think that's the point I'm trying to make. They're not natural. I never use the word natural. I mean, the one thing that a gay man will never do is use the word natural casually. It's been thrown in my face too many times. So I don't use it. And you can ask any of my students that. It's not natural. These are deliberate spaces built with intent. In material life worlds, using expertise, in the space of strong constraints, right? So I spend a lot of my time trying to narrate the stories of how people build housing incrementally. Why do they build at the pace they build? Why do they replace one wall at one time? What's the aesthetic behind it? What's the logic behind it? And it frustrates me a lot that very often we reduce the sense of what we consider informal, quote unquote, housing as simply economically constrained. There's less money, so therefore the house is X, which is simply not true. Right? So one of the stories of the houses that we're building is, why did you decide to build a second floor? It's because actually my daughter decided to have an affair, and the mother and the person she was trying to go with, their parents were objecting to the marriage. So they ran away and we needed a place for them to hide. So we built a second floor. Now that's a story of narrative housing where the life cycle of housing, right? So John Turner, housing is a process, it's a verb, it's time, it's a unit, right? And when we think about the, when you think about the national housing policy we have right now, 30 square meters, 25 square meters, this flat, this life fit into this. So I think that what I'm saying is, of course, those spaces are also spaces of power struggle. I'm not romanticizing the informal as a space of deep kind of, this our love. So the informal for us is either a problem to be solved or such a romantic space that it has no vulnerability. It is neither of those two things. And so the question is how to engage to it, like Tatyana is saying, not as solution providers. And I will be honest, I think, I was trained as a sociologist. So we have no burden of solution because no one expects us to solve anything. So therefore, there are two kinds of problems with your training. One where you are constantly told to solve things, and the other where you're never told to solve anything. And I can tell you, as much as you're angry about your studio right now, come to a graduate seminar in social theory. It's a very different kind of existential angst. So we all have our burdens to bear. And the good thing about it is, what the actual form of Indian cities teaches you is that the world is not built in formal education classrooms anymore. So they're not, even if they're frustrating, we are not reduced to them, right? This is exactly why forums like this exist. So I think the question of learning, all our formal structures, the university is always catching up to the world. And if anything the cities will teach us is that we're never going to be current. We are, many of us here teach in classrooms. You can take it from us. We don't have the capacity to get it all right. We just don't. We try our best. We try and mess it up in an interesting way. But I think the thing we rely on is that the city can teach you. And I think that's the point of spatial practice that I'm interested in. So if architectural schools, for example, took Sanya's idea of retrofit seriously, took repair seriously, and actually worked on already existing built form and say, you can't build it, it's built, someone built it. How can you enable? How can you be present here? What do you have to contribute? And you all have really fantastic skills to contribute. Like my mother would never forgive me if one induced what she calls paralysis by analysis, right? There are things to do. There are settlements in all our cities that have no underground drainage, that don't have structurally safe materials, that are built in completely inadequate forms. Romanticizing that form as informality is not acceptable because the people who are in those settlements are repairing, building, growing, protecting every day. So to me, the question is not that all our uncontrolled spaces are ableist and just controlled. They're not. Many of our cities have built forms that are hanging on and protesting against these systems of power. Let's learn from those spatial practices. Let's augment, let's think about how to, and it's not just architecture, right? So, I'm from Delhi. All of East Delhi was built without any underground drainage under it, right? So all of it has to be retrofitted and acupunctured and somehow reinserted into a landscape, but it was not built. Now, no engineering textbook teaches you how to put underground drainage when the building already exists. We don't know what materials to use. We don't know whether or not to move the house. We don't know how to do it. It's the same thing with architectural. Outside heritage and conservation, we don't teach repair. We teach construction. Why don't we teach repair? Much of our built form is about repair. So I want to take the possibilities of repair seriously. How do we make it faster, better? How do we make it continue to be affordable? So I think that there are, when the National Law School started, the nicest thing it did is most people who studied law there never became lawyers. They became fantastic practitioners of all kinds, right? And that early generation, the current National Law School produces not just lawyers, but corporate lawyers, but that's another story. But I have, to me, to be trained as an architect with those skill sets does not mean a certain kind of practice. Our practice should not equate so easily to our profession, but this is not easy to do. It is a very naive and innocent, to use that word that we've thrown to other people. It's innocent of me to say, just don't do it, because the real world constraints, the privilege of breaking with that profession is enormous. So I think that we have to think curricularly on how we can make that chance to have different practices not require so much social and economic privilege. Right? Because people have to get jobs. You do have bosses, you have briefs, and you have clients. So I think that there is a lot to also teach and say, how do I take move incrementally within its constraints. If I have the time to imagine a new project, how do I do that? We can't just say reimagine everything from tomorrow, right? So to me, that incrementality of saying you have a degree, I had a teacher once who used to say, you're not going to win all of it at once, but push a degree of freedom each time. Push incrementally. I mean, that's what the build form taught us, right? That it grows incrementally. So I think that there are ways to sow seeds of this. So I also don't want us to leave, especially all of you, with the sense that one has to either be completely like sorted and amazing and participatory, or you are like building a horrible building in aluco bond and glass. Like those are not the two options in the world. But it takes time to open up those spaces. They don't open up automatically. It's slowly over time you get a chance. But the thing is, you have to be looking for that chance. Because if you're not looking for that chance, it won't come. Then suddenly it'll be like 10 years later and you'll be like, wow, I did a lot of projects. What exactly was I doing? So I think the idea is to open up our strategies, to think about spatial practices, to really try and shift at the beginning. If we can just shift the studio out to existing and diverse built environments, that alone will help. Because it will push us to say, what do I need to understand this? It's not the tools I was taught. And so let at least the sites challenge our curriculum, even if the administration is not willing to rethink them overnight. One idea.
Thank you. It's already past 9. So I'd love for the panelists to maybe wrap up if there are any last thoughts, and we can call it a night. And even the presenters, yeah, please.
I want to add something.
Yes,
so as the topic is human conflict, so my main concern about this, my intervention was that the conflict shouldn't be happening on the basis of a proposal. The proposal should not cause a conflict between the citizens, like the statues might do at some point of time, because after their construction is done, there will be a huge giant personality standing in middle of a context. So this might trigger some communities to comment on something, and might cause a disturbance or a disturbance within the communities. So I try to solve that problem by giving a space, a democratic space, under which conflicts can happen, but a solution which is provided by a space can happen also. So I'm saying that the structure shouldn't cause the conflict. In fact, it should house the conflict to happen and also give a solution with it. Because as Sir said, there are many spaces which are democratic in nature, like open spaces like bazaar or markets, railway stations. So there are different level of democracies involved there. So and also ignorance within the citizens of Indian citizens is also accountable in that sense, because if someone wants a structure to be built, like a statue to be built, they will support it, but end of the day they will have to pay like $1,000 to enter the structure, but their economic condition won't be that good. So end of the day, ignorance within the society or education level is a must if we speak of a democracy, because of democracy there are slums everywhere. Because of democracy it actually helps people to migrate, people to live in poor condition. Like Sir mentioned, there is poor drainage system everywhere. It is also because of democracy, also because there is a loophole in democracy and people are ignorant to avoid talking about it or observe it. So,
yeah. Perhaps I can offer a few concluding remarks, and thank you for that, Suchetan. I really was struck by a lot of this conversation, and I think that to echo some of what Gautam said, we don't seek to suggest that we have any answers or solutions, but I think there are traits and tendencies that we definitely encourage. And I think one of the things that this conversation has done for me is that it has opened up the question of the agency of the architect. And the agency of the architect has to be politicized, in my view. It has to be contextualized in an India which has actually been seeing all kinds of forms of democracy that are in fact being, forms of speech that are being eroded upon, forms of agency that are being eroded upon. This idea that somehow conflict is to be avoided actually causes more conflict, obviously. And so the fact that democracy is a celebration of a certain kind of conflict, and that if you critique something, you are not apatriotic. In fact, critique is a form of patriotism. And that understanding is something that we can imbibe as architects, because we then have political agency. And I think that the understanding of the political is also embedded very, 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 very much so in aspects of the university, in aspects of curriculum, and also in aspects of the administration of the university. I'm sitting on so many reviews right now, discussions within the faculty at Carnegie Mellon, and there is, and other universities, and there is such a giant buzz about reducing the amount of fees that students are paying. $200,000, $100,000 debts. So when you graduate, you're forced to work for the neoliberal capital. The next 10 years, 20 years of your life are laid out for you. You are a pawn. And I think that therefore I think we have to understand that being an architect is being a citizen, and being a citizen means everything, right? And so immediately you are embedded in questions of curriculum, questions of administration, and very, very, very much so again in questions of representation, drawing, material constructs, right? The ways in which we draw a perspective versus a flat elevation. The fact that we haven't yet drawn time in a way that is totally embedded in our representations. All of these questions are political questions, and I think we should embrace the conflicts embedded in the political questions that come with constructing a world, right? But this was really fantastic. I'm going to keep it brief because I know we are way over time. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Professor Chaya, Tatyana.
Hi.
Oh, Nikita, please.
Yeah. So I was actually thinking what a space of negotiation should be. If we actually deliberately build a space for it, we don't know if it would be taken over by the people or it would be used for it. But if we don't, like right now, there is no discussion or dialogue happening between various groups. So the right thing, when actually in my project, I thought that I would actually give a space where negotiations could happen, which is also like an utopian imagination that hopefully they would. So how else could we do it if not by building a space for it?
There isn't a direct answer to every problem. If you say a place where people could meet, most often it will be places which were designed for something else. And it might be very interesting to look at the chance ways in which places where people go become places where they start doing things together, or fighting with each other, or agreeing with each other, or whatever. And I think by making one public space so large and so elaborate, that is commerce and politics. These are the two. Money and power want to control how we behave in public. And the way we will get over it is by finding other places. And a very, very interesting work by actually finding such places and gently enhancing some things in each of them. And that would require details the possibilities of having a festival there once in a while and so on. So you have to look for places rather than make places if you're looking at public. Yeah.
So for my project, I actually was dealing with it where I'm saying that I don't want to make a separate civic center where people would have to go, but it's an extension of their everyday lives where people go to the BRTS stop and that itself becomes a civic space for it. It's not a third space that people go as a civic to interact, but it's an everyday space where they would just pass by the bridge and see the things happening around, and in a way that the everyday weaves with this civic participation.
So, yeah.
Professor Chaya, we can't hear you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tatyana, any closing comments? Anything that you can?
Well, definitely, I agree with Sarosh in extending the congratulations on the panelists, co-panelists, and everybody that has feed into this discussion. I think it has been really fruitful and for me also very interesting. I also, like, if I can say of something that I would take on is this comment of Sarosh saying that we shouldn't work on binaries and we should find these places of negotiations. No, so it's neither the architect and the user, but neither we are all, the same. So how can we find those in between spaces, or how can it be sometimes and in other times other things? I really like that possibility of ending those notions of binaries. And thank you very much for these discussions. It has been super enriching. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you all the panelists, Tatyana, Sarosh, Professor Chaya, Gautam, but also Vatsal, Sania, Suchetan, Fakin, and Nikita for offering up your projects to actually give rise to these discussions. Chaya wants to say something else as well. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Professor Chaya, if you can turn your video off, maybe we'll have more bandwidth.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
To apologize to people presented to my comments were
yeah, can't hear you.
How our system has taken hold. Okay, so then we'll leave it.
Sorry about that. But yes, thank you everyone very much again. And I'm sure some of the conversations that came up, and especially the ones around that Gautam ended with around renovation, as well as Sarosh and Tatyana talking about the agency of the architect and exerting your imagination in other realms, will be picked up when we talk about, I think, human nature and maybe hopefully open up notions of sustainability beyond certain technocratic narratives that currently seem to be of vogue. That will be, I think, the day after tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll hear from Gautam and Sarosh. So yeah, until then, thank you so much.
Thank you all for joining us today. It indeed has been a super overwhelming and insightful discussion. And we are all sure this is going to stay with us for a really long time, and we will keep coming back to it. I would also like to thank everyone on behalf of KVDF team for joining us today on Zoom as well as on YouTube Live. Please do join us tomorrow at 7 p.m. onward for an engaging deep talk between Gautam Bhan and Sarosh Anklesaria. Do visit our website for all the information on further schedules and details. Thanks a lot again.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thanks.